Good morning, church. Thanks for joining us online. We are going to praise, we're going to honor and glorify our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Will you please join us?
You are not a God created by human hands. You are not a God dependent on any mortal man. You are not a God in need of anything we can give by your plan. That's just the way it is.
You're the only God whose power none can contend. You're the only God whose name and praise will never end. You're the only God who's worthy of everything we can give. You are God. That's just the way it is. You are God alone from before time began. You are on your throne. You are God alone. And right now, in the good times and bad, you are on your throne. You are God alone. You're unchangeable. You're unshakable. You're unstoppable. That's what you are. You're unchangeable. You're unshakable. You're unstoppable. That's what you are. You are God alone from before time began. You are on your throne. You are God alone. And right now, in the good times and bad, you are on your throne. You are God alone. O sovereign God, O matchless King, the saints adore, the angels sing, and fall before the throne of grace. To you belongs the highest praise. These sufferings, this passing time, under your wings I will abide, and every enemy shall flee. You are my hope and victory. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one, clothed in power and in grace, the name above all other names. To the valley for my soul, my great descendants made me whole. Praise the Spirit, create one, clothed in power and in grace, the name above all other names, the name above all other names.
Love you, Lord, for your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire. In darkest night, you are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me.
Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With a life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able,
I will sing of the goodness of God.
And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so
Hey there, Graceway Church. So glad that you have tuned in again this week. And I'm glad that Adam and the worship team were able to lead us in some songs today. Sometimes we just need something familiar that grants a sense of calmness for us and as a help. Sometimes, though, we also just need a little bit of humor to lighten the load, a little bit of laughter. As we were watching the sermon from this past week, my son Grant laughed out loud at the point at which I was bemoaning the difficulty of delivering a message to a unresponsive camera. And he pushed the pause button and he explained that apparently this is a common experience for pastors preaching in these empty sanctuaries all over the place, trying to get through that. He said he saw where one church decided they'd try to help their pastor out. And so when the pastor came in to preach, the sanctuary pews were filled with a multitude of life-sized cardboard cutouts of Disney characters. There's Elsa and her sister Anna, Buzz and Woody, and then in the back row, Shrek has slipped in and is sleeping soundly with Donkey at his side. This whole virus situation is dragging some of us as pastors into 21st century technology, and some of us kicking and screaming. I mean, there are a lot of ways to mess this up. Maybe you saw this on YouTube this past week. What I've got is a priest in Italy, if I can get my equipment to work here. Here's a priest in Italy that has decided to use Facebook Live, and he apparently accidentally added the googly eyes filter. I'm sure his congregation all saw the video that week, but I'm not sure any of them remember the content of his message. Or how about this one? There's a vicar, Stephen Beach, in Plymouth. I'm not sure what state that is. But as you watch, pay attention to his shoulder blade there. He gets a little too close to the flame. Oh my, he says. Should have gone with holy smokes. We don't have a crowd of cardboard cutouts here today. There's no lit candles, and I'm not trying to film this myself. I am entrusting this to the professionals, and I'm going to trust him to not overlay any googly eyes during the editing phase. In today's sermon, we're going to learn that the name God gave to Abraham and Sarah's son, even before he was conceived, is Isaac, which roughly translates to, he laughs, or may he laugh. There's a pattern in the storytelling, though, where the name takes on a slightly different meaning as the story progresses in different scenes. Who's the one that's laughing, and what does the laughter signify in each case? What came to mind for me was a pattern that I have observed in some folk songs or perhaps country music where a story is being told. And very often, though the chorus remains exactly the same, the identical words in each case, the meaning of the chorus shifts slightly based on the verses that precede it, the context in which it is said. So verse 1 might start the story, and then there's a chorus, and it relates to what we've just heard. And then there's verse 2, and it slightly changes the meaning of the words when we sing chorus 2 and hear that. And then there's a third verse, and when the chorus is sung, it seems deeper and richer the third time through. And so it is in today's text. The name Isaac, which means he laughs, takes on different meanings as we progress through the narratives. I invite you to grab a Bible right where you're there in your home, or if you're watching this while traveling or hanging out with others in your house. Grab a Bible. Please turn to Genesis chapter 17. I want to show you 3 different scenes and some progression in the meaning of the name as this story unfolds before us. But before we get there, we're going to need some background. I want to lay that out for you. 2 pieces of background. The first is the covenant. The second has to do with the names. The covenant is an agreement. It's a contract. But it's not between equals. This covenant that is described in chapter 17 is patterned after a type of ancient agreement between a superpower and a weaker partner. And let me try to illustrate it this way with a more modern scenario. Picture, if you will, Bruno on the playground. Big, tall, strapping bruiser of a 5th grader. "Hey, you weaklings," he says to the 2nd graders. "We're going to take on those kids from the south side who are playing on our swing set. Tell them to get lost. You are all on my team. But let's get something straight. If we're going to work together, we got to come to an understanding, see? You're on my team. That means when I say jump, you jump. When I say kick, you kick. When I say punch, you punch. And we're going to take back that swing set for ourselves." To which one of the weakling 2nd graders raises a hand and says, "Oh, Mr. Bruno, sir, this all sounds good and fine, but what can I expect in return for my undying devotion and loyalty?" "Well, I suppose you can go down the slide. After me, of course. And if things go sideways, I'll protect you from them south side kids. But make sure you never double-cross me, see? Otherwise, I'll punch your lights out myself." "Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. That sounds mighty fine." What is that? That's a covenant. It's a suzerain vassal covenant where a regional superpower has partnered up with a weaker partner, and they've arranged an agreement. It spells out the stipulations, what each party can expect from the others, the consequences of breaking the agreement, and the nature of their relationship. That's what we have in chapter 17. But instead of Bruno, we have an all-powerful God. And instead of trying to take back a slide on the one part of the playground, he's trying to take back his whole planet. He's got a plan in place. And he has decided to shower blessings on this aging, elderly couple who can offer him no strategic advantage. There's nothing that Abraham and Sarah can offer that helps God. Instead, God has said, "I have a plan for rescuing the world, and I want to work through you, and I want to work through your family to do that." But in order to do so, we need to have an understanding of how this relationship is going to work. So chapter 17 details that agreement. Now, I won't take the time to read through or unpack it. Let me just give you a quick summary. Verses 1 and 2 give a preamble. Here is the overview of what's in mind, what he's proposing. God says, I am God Almighty. Here's what I'm proposing to do for you. In return, I expect you to live out your life in my presence and faithfully serve me. And then if you let your eyes go down to verse 4, you'll see it starts out, as for me, this is my covenant with you. As for me, here's what I'm pledging to do for you. And then in verse 9, God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep, here's what I'm requiring of you. Verse 4 through 8 is what God is going to do. Verse 9 through 14 is what he's requesting and expecting from Abraham. And what God's offering is he's promising to give children, he's promising to give land, and he's promising to enter into this covenant with all future generations of Abram and Sarah's children. And what he's expecting, well, don't miss it from verse 1, walk before me and be blameless. There's an expectation that Abram would walk in a way that's honoring to God. And then he gives in verses 10 through 14 what the sign of the covenant would be. Circumcision. That every male would be circumcised. That may sound very odd to us, very strange. Strange way to be reminded. Many times the covenant would be entered into, there would be a way of being reminded. They might build a monument, and every time armies would pass by that monument, they would be reminded of the agreement that they had settled. They would not attack the other. This seems like a strange way to have a sign that reminds of the covenant. But it's probably more appropriate than you would initially think. The sign is sexual because it's intended to join faith with the act of reproduction. This covenant's about God giving children as the covenant people live in obedience to him. And so all the males will have their foreskin trimmed as a permanent physical reminder that in the most intimate of acts, God is the one that provides children. And that God calls them to live out their lives in purity. So verses 10 through 14 spell out those expectations. It's a contract, it's a covenant, it's an agreement. The second thing that I want us to understand as far as background is how God changes their names. Oh, it looks like about verse 5. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham. And likewise, in verse 15, he changes Sarai's name to Sarah. The name Abraham is probably just a variation of Abram, spoken by a different dialect. This is something similar to going from Charles to Charlie, or George to Jorge, Andrea, or Andrea. We had a woman that lived with our family as I was growing up. My oldest sister's roommate from college came, lived with our family for a decade in the late 70s and early 80s. We always knew her as Brenda. When she went home to New England, the state of Maine, she was always referred to as Brender, where they would add an R in places where it isn't there, or subtracting them where they are. Brenda or Brender. There's no appreciable difference in the meaning between Abraham and Abram. They both likely mean exalted father. The difference is in what they're referring to. His given name at birth, Abram, exalted father, probably referred to Abram's father, Terah. It's a name that looks to the past, implying that Abram came from noble lineage. It's all about where he came from. The new name, Abraham, looks to the future. And there's a word play, a sound play that's going on, where Abraham sounds like the Hebrew phrase, father of multitude. The new name would be a constant reminder that God had intended to make of Abraham make him a father of nations and kings. And similarly, Sarai and Sarah seem to be simply variations of each other. Both spellings mean princess or queen. Like the name Abram, the name Sarai symbolized the past. The new name Sarah would be a reminder of what God intended to do for Sarah in the future. She's going to give birth to whole nations, and royalty will come from her. So in issuing new names for this covenant couple, God's changing their status, He's changing their circumstances, and He's redirecting their focus from where they were and where they came from to where they are now and where He's taking them. It's God that's determining their future, not where they were in the past. Last week we talked about Ishmael and the significance of his name, meaning God hears. This week we want to look at the birth of Isaac, whose name means he laughs. But who is the he? Who is it that's laughing? And what does the laughter signify? This theme of laughter figures large in the stories leading up to his birth. While you're there in Genesis 17, I'm going to point out the first scene here. Look down at verse 15. I'm going to title it Abraham Laughs. Abraham laughs. Chapter 17, verse 15. God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you're no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Abraham fell face down, likely on his knees and touching his forehead to the soil. He laughed and he said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? In his thoughts, there is disbelief. This is inconceivable. Maybe God, you haven't seen the obstacles that we're working with down here right now. This does not seem like something that can be pulled off. And so Abraham proposes an alternative in verse 18. Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. And I take that to be a request. God, maybe you can provide this promise through Ishmael. Maybe you can provide the descendants and give land through the descendants of Ishmael. I have a son. God clarifies, said, no, not in that way. Initially, God communicated, you're going to have a descendant. And through those descendants, I'm going to bless you. And when he didn't have a child, Abraham initially thought, well, maybe it has to be through a servant that was born in my house. That would be the legal heir of my house. And God at one point clarifies this, no, it's not going to be through that. It's going to be a descendant from your own body, Abraham. And so then he begins to consider perhaps God's going to fulfill this through Ishmael, a son with another wife, a different wife. And God says, no, it's not going to be that way. It's going to be through a descendant of you, Abraham, and through your wife, Sarah. And Abraham's response is mixed. He laughs and he obeys. He laughs and he obeys. He laughs a laugh of disbelief. How can this happen? I don't see any way for this to occur. She's old, I'm old. And yet there's evidence of faith even in the midst of this response. For one, he immediately begins using the new name, Sarah, as an act of faith in what God has said about her future, as an act of obedience to what God has said. Will Sarah bear a child? He also follows through in obedience as verse 23 says, on that very same day after God went up from him, Abraham took his son Ishmael, all those born in his household, bought with his money every male in his household, and circumcised them as God told him. On that very day, stressing immediacy, as God told him, stressing obedience. And we're told in God's response there in 19 told the name of this child. God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. He laughs. And I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant, and for his descendants after him. And then verse 21, my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. We're told the name of the child is to be Isaac. He laughs. And in the context of scene 1, it's Abraham that's laughing. And it's a laughter of disbelief. Let's move on to the second scene. It takes place in chapter 18. Chapter 18 begins with the appearance of the Lord to Abraham. And Abraham is residing near these great trees of Mamre. While he's sitting there at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. And when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. We're not sure exactly at what point in the story that Abraham begins to perceive who these visitors are. We're told as the readers that the Lord visited him. It appears as we read into chapter 19 that it is the Lord and 2 angels that have come to visit. Abraham, with Sarah's help and that of others, prepares a meal for them. He begs them to stay, and they agree to, and they enter into, share a meal together. While they eat, Abram stands nearby under a tree. In verse 9, we pick up the story with the dialogue and the reason for their visit. Where's your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said. And the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now, Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure of conceiving, this pleasure of having a child, this pleasure of being a mother? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And I'll return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, and so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. The second scene I would entitle Sarah Laughs. And again, it is a laughter of disbelief, of just being incredulous. This is crazy to think of this. She's aware of all of the obstacles, all that would prevent this. And yet the Lord asks Abram, why? Why did Sarah laugh? Why would she say, will I really have a child? Is there anything that's too hard for the Lord? That word was translated there as hard. It means to be wonderful, to be extraordinary, to be surpassing, to be amazing. It's used, for instance, in Isaiah 9 as a part of the name of the Messiah. This child who would come, who would be a ruler, is called a wonderful counselor. That's the same word there. Is anything too amazing, too extraordinary, too surpassing? Is there anything that's outside of his skill set? Really? Is his arm too short that he cannot rescue? I'm reminded in the Gospels of how Jesus, in his teaching, presented the same character quality of God. He insisted that there's nothing impossible. It's impossible for men. In the context, he spoke about how it's harder for a rich person to be saved, to come into the kingdom, than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And many were shocked at that statement, thinking the rich were certainly favored by God. Then who can be saved? Well, this is impossible with men, Jesus said. But not impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with God. I'm also reminded in this context of Jesus' encounter with a father. A man whose son was suffering from demon possession. And often throughout this child's life, the demon would throw him into convulsions. And sometimes he'd fallen into water and near drowned, and sometimes into fire, and they had to rescue him often. And as the father brings him before Jesus and explains the background of the story, he pleads with Jesus and he says, if you can do something, would you have mercy? Would you have pity and do something for this boy? And you can almost envision Jesus' eyebrows going up as he said, if you can? Excuse me? Anything's possible for those who believe. God can do what he needs to do, what he plans to do. Even that which seems humanly impossible, that which is behind barriers way too high for us. Sarah laughs. But the final scene, I'm going to entitle God Laughs. God laughs. And it's over in chapter 21, where the report of Isaac's birth. Flip over there, take a look at this as we wrap up. Verse 21, verses 1 through 7. Now, the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said. Pay attention to all the times that it mentions God's speaking, his message, his keeping of his promise. The Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. And everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now who's laughing? It's an entirely different sense of the word. When they name the boy, he laughs. Sure, there are reminders of their momentary and the experience of disbelief. Sarah says, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears this story will laugh with me. God has been pleased to fulfill his promises in ways that seem impossible. The Lord is able to keep his promises in spite of apparent difficulties and barriers. And it seems that this series of stories is intended to communicate that for the Lord, nothing is too extraordinary. He delights in doing what is impossible, what's marvelous, what's even surpassing. Are there promises from God that you have encountered in the Word for which you are challenged, of which it is a challenge for you to believe? Things that God has spoken, of which you're not sure you really buy into. Maybe it's the message from last week, the message of Ishmael's name. He hears. God hears. That God's alive, that he sees you, and that he cares, and that he hears. And maybe because of the circumstances that you have seen all around you, you're not convinced that's true. You're not sure that he's really listening. Because if he was, things would be different. What I'm reminded of in this story is the number of years this couple waited. And at the appointed time, it says, at the very time God had promised, the deliverance came. So I don't know what sort of situation you might be facing, but God's got a timetable, and it may not be the same as our timetable. We look to him to answer that, to pull that through. Are there promises from God that seem impossible to you? I'm reminded that he cares for the sparrow, that he's monitoring the condition of the sparrow. And therefore, Jesus argues, he cares for you as well. He's knowledgeable of what's going on in your life, and he genuinely is paying attention in his caring. His provision, his promise of provision. Jesus looked at the fields, and he saw flowers on grass that would soon wither and die. And he says, if God will clothe the grain of the field in this way, won't he take care of you, O you of little faith? The question that God asked, that the Lord asked of Abram, why did Sarah laugh? Why, behind the tent cover, would she right? Sure. Yeah, I bet. Why take that attitude? Is anything too hard, too marvelous, too challenging, too out of reach for the Lord? What is surprising to the speaker is that she would laugh at the promise. He's amazed that she's laughing. Why did Sarah laugh? And the reason is because he knows who's making the promise. He knows the capabilities of the one making the promise. My hope, and one of the things that I'm praying for as we walk through some very difficult days, both now and anticipate days of difficulty in the future, is that we would know the one who has made these promises. Do you know him? Are you trusting him? Are you in his word? Are you filling your mind with these promises? That indeed he cares and he will provide. That he can transform a life. That a person can be born again, changed, transformed. That the work that he has begun in your life and the lives of children and the lives of others that you're concerned for, he promises to continue that good work until the day of Christ Jesus. That there is a day of Christ Jesus. That this hope that one day Christ will return, that he will establish his kingdom on a resurrected and renewed earth, that he will be in charge. And he will entrust to us in that regeneration responsibility that looks like ruling and sharing in the care of this restored earth and the people of it. Are there promises from God that seem too far out of reach, too difficult to accomplish? The promise that Jesus said, if one believes in me, I myself will raise him up from the dead on the last day. We have attended a lot of funerals over the years. Never seen someone get up out of a casket. Never seen someone resurrect from a grave. Haven't seen it. Seems like really challenge to believe. We're told and we live in a culture that surrounds us and drowns us in this thought. You just live for a period of time, then you go out of existence. That's not what Jesus said. It's contrary to his promises. Do you believe in what he is saying? Do you know the one who's making the promise? That's my hope. When we think about Isaac, he laughs. I hope that just like a folk song or a country music song, you might see the twisting of that and the changes of the meaning of that name. Sometimes, like that man that Jesus encountered and said, if you believe, if you're able to. His response was, Lord, I do believe. Help my unbelief. I do believe. Help my unbelief. I hope that would be our cry as a word from God back to him. Lord, I do believe. I want to follow in obedience. I know it's imperfect. I know it's broken. But help my unbelief. Help me where I am tending to laugh, where I'm not believing, not taking you at your word. God, would you do these type of works in our lives, in these days, in this time, and help us as we seek to minister to others. That's my hope. That's my prayer for Grace Ray Church. Thanks so much for being here, sharing in this time together via video today. May God bless you. Amen.
Great is thy